So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you on a relatively cold and rainy May day. But I think the discussion is going to warm us all up. I want to just take 1 minute of your time to thank both our guests this evening. A very great thanks to Chantal Mouffe, who is our fellow this year. She's been with us a couple of years ago as well as a fellow. And a great thanks goes to her for livening up the atmosphere at the IWM over the years. And a very special warm welcome and thanks to Mr. Peter Engelmann, who is our new cooperation partner. We just started this year, for those of you who do not know of this, our new series with Passagen Verlag. So this is the first book which appeared in the IWM Passagen Verlag series. It appears together with a second book on Reden über die Reinheit. Das is Valentin Gröbner. I don't have a copy in my hand, but we do have the books displayed outside. So that'll give you a chance to see them. All I want to say is this is a wonderful beginning of our new book project with the Passagen Verlag. The books are going to be in very different formats. So there will be single essays, 2 collected volumes, 2 volume of essays by an individual author. So let me just take the opportunity to announce the 2 that are coming in autumn, the one edited by my colleague Ivan Voivoda on Brexit, and the one edited by my colleague Aisha Chawla on contentious politics, the politics of austerity and the city. Those are the 2 coming in October. And let me with that just hand over to my colleague Ludger Hagedorn, who is the editor of this volume on democracy, Wenn Demokratien, demokratisch, untergehen. So I wish you a wonderful evening and thank you for being with us tonight. And I should say, after the discussion, there is wine and cheese downstairs. So please don't go away. Please go down the stairs to some good wine and cheese.
So thank you, Shalini Randeria, rector of IWM, who is also a co-editor of the book, but she left this pleasant task of speaking about the book to me. And I'm aware that I'm the last one to keep you away from what Shalini introduced as a warming discussion on a cold and rainy evening. So it's not very nice to keep you away from that. So I'll promise to be quite short. Just to say a few words on the book that Shalini and I edited together with Katharina Hasovent, who's over there, and we are also very thankful to her for adding a lot of work to this volume. And we decided for tonight to not do a book presentation that sometimes can be very bothersome if you speak about contents of the book and this article and that article and the other article. But we decided to have a debate between the owner and the founder of the publishers house Passagen Verlag, Peter Engelmann, and between Chantal Mouffe, who is one of the contributors to this volume. And in that sense, I do not want to give you a summary of the whole book and make up for that we will not explicitly and mainly discuss the book, but we'll have a political debate tonight. Let me just say a few words what this book with the title Wenn Demokratien, demokratisch, untergehen is about. If I would give you one line of thought, and I promise I'll be short on this, it would just be 2 or 3 minutes. If I would give you one line of thought of the idea behind this book, I would say that it is very much about the apparent and tremendous success of democracy, the global spread of democracy, the democratization of societies that we experience in our times, but at the same time, the astonishing and strange effect that we see in democracies of today, that we witness processes of a hollowing out or of a excavation of democracies from the inside of democracies. And this is what we succinctly tried to put into the title of Wenn Demokratien, demokratisch untergehen, so when democracies perish democratically. If we start off with this idea of democracy on the one hand having a reputation an unbattled reputation that it maybe never had before to such a degree as it has today, but on the other hand is hollowed out from the inside, then the question is what to do with this diagnosis, how to react to this. And I think that the 9 authors who we have in this volume, all of them have developed their own answers to this analysis. One of them is Jan Werner Müller, and he would say that he became very famous with his analysis of populism, and he would say that our speaking about illiberal democracies, this is a term that is referred to for democracies like Hungary and Turkey of today, the Erdogan and Orban democracies, that we should not speak about illiberal democracies, but that we should contest the notion of democracy as such. These politicians might even be proud of being called illiberal Democrats, but what we should really say about them is that they are not democratic any longer. This is what really would describe the situation better. And so he prefers to speak about beschädigte Demokratie, damaged democracies. Very similarly, another political scientist, Klaus Offe, who says that what we witness in populism of today is a identification or an equation of what famously in Rousseau is on the one hand called the volonté de tout and on the other hand the volonté générale, and these are superficially identified as if there were one will of the people, neglecting that within democracies there's also opposing views or minorities. Sorry. So Klaus Offe, Jan Werner Müller I mentioned as 2 authors. Another one I could mention is our colleague Ivan Krastev, well known to many of you I guess, who tries to develop the potential within the populist movements that can also that also has a capacity for the self-correction of democracy. This gives us another view of how to react on this diagnosis. With these words, I will hand over to Peter Engelmann and Chantal Mouffe. I wish you a pleasant evening, good discussion. Shalini already said you're invited for wine and cheese afterwards. And one more thing, once you have bought the book afterwards, we have it outside. Have a look at page 120, 121. 4 ways how to abolish democracy. Very short. I'd recommend this to you. Thanks. Good evening.
So again, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Troisième fois. I also would like to welcome you tonight at the Institute for the Wissenschaft for Human Science, English. I would like to welcome especially Chantal Mouffe, who is tonight with us to discuss, to present her position in this debate about leftist populism, about how we can face this crisis of democracy we speak about since a long time, and we speak in Austria especially since Friday. Okay, I have not to explain this. Before we start, I want to thank also Ludger Hagedorn and Shalini Ranieri and Katharina. I know her only by Katharina, who did a great job on the book, on producing the book, together with the people of Passagen, Martin Born, who is also here. The people of the publishing house are always forgotten. Yeah, I know this. This collaboration, which we start with this new book, which was named several times today, is not new. We have Passagen Verlag and the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna were founded about at about the same time in the beginning of the 80s, and since then we had conferences together. I remember Jacques Derrida, who was here very early. I think it was the first institution who invited. The institute invites toujours always because they have the money, and we bring the authors. And since then, we publish a series of books which they are presented outside in the library. This is very impressive what we did together. Then we had a pause, and now we restarted with with a book that really meets maybe the most important question of today. We all are afraid, even afraid, what means this rise of right-wing populist movements in Europe. And we have different ways of approaching it, and one of the most interesting positions is Chantal Mouffe. Usually we speak about right-wing populism, or we don't differentiate between populism. Populism on the left seems to be a Schimpfwort. What is that?
Oxymoron, maybe.
Yeah. But Chantal Mouffe will explain to us that that populism must not be, has not to be necessarily a bad thing, and she argues that the left should better think about why people who are obviously not right-wing vote for these right-wing populist movements. There's a leak on the left in explaining this fact, and in order to, and if we want to fight this loss of people to these right-wing parties, we have to first of all to analyze what the reasons are why the people go to these movements. Chantal Mouffe starts with a notion, I think, with a statement. She says she calls this our situation, our political situation, a populist moment. Populism, she developed this notion with Ernesto Laclau early in a book which was published in the 90s, at the beginning of the 90s, at Passagen. Is more than for her more than a single phenomena that as it is seen usually. For her, it is a crisis of hegemonic formation. It's a notion of she developed also with Ernesto Laclau. Let's start with this question. How can this populist movement be characterized? What are the chances of this situation for you?
So in fact, and here I want to refer to the title that they've given to our presentation. I think it's Democracy and its Enemies or something like that. And I think that we must be, I would definitely want to resist the way in which the actual conjuncture, which I call the populist moment, and I'm in a moment going to explain what I mean by that. But I think that there is some kind of a narrative saying that democracies are, put it into danger by the development of those right-wing or populist movement, and that what we need to do is to defend democracy against that. And for instance, the typical example of that is the strategy of Emmanuel Macron. For instance, no for the election. European election, but also in general, it's me or chaos. So it's between Salvini or Marine Le Pen, and I'm the defender of democracy, and the other ones are the one who speak of populist leper. Some other people are speaking of the return of the brown plague, and I think that, and this is what I want to explain, this is extremely counterproductive to see things in that way. Because in fact, we need to understand that what I call the populist moment is the actual conjuncture in Western Europe. And it's because there is a crisis of neoliberal hegemony. This populist moment is the expression of the crisis. And this crisis of neoliberal hegemony manifests itself by a series of resistances against what I call the post-democratic situation, which has been the consequence of 30 years of neoliberal hegemony. So in fact, when we are told that we need to defend democracy, I'm answer, our societies are not democratic. Our societies cease to be democratic. They are post-democratic. So we should certainly not defend them in their present stage. What this crisis indicates is that there is something really wrong with the state of our democracy, and we need to see what's the problem there, and in fact trying to give a solution to that. Because I think that here maybe I should say something about this concept of post-democracy, because of course I'm not the only one to use that. Colin Crowe, that you've been publishing, speak of that. In fact, he's the one who really coined the term, but Jacques Rancière also speaks of post-democracy. I use this term of post-democracy in I agree with what both Rancière and Colin Crowe say, but I use it in a particularly a bit different way, because I use it to indicate that the problem, well, one of the problems with our societies today is that the two main values of democracy, which are equality and popular sovereignty, have been, relinquished because they are obsolete. In moment of neoliberal globalization, popular sovereignty and equality, So this is what I call, we are not anymore in democratic society, we are in post-democracies, because societies in which there is no, the central values are not anymore popular sovereignty and equality. For me, this is not democratic. And I think that it's important to understand how we arrived there. And as I say, it's 30 years of neoliberal hegemony, which are the origin of that. And it manifested this move towards post-democracy in two different ways. One, which I've called in my work on the political, this post-politics, and that relates to the fact of the abandon of popular sovereignty, because popular sovereignty, of course, I'm using that in a very wide way. There is a lot of discussion in political theory about popular sovereignty. In a sense, I must say I agree with Kelsen when he said that popular sovereignty is some kind of totemic mask. But what I understand by popular sovereignty is the fact that people need to feel that they've got a voice, they've got a choice. So when they are election, they need to be given the possibilities to choose between different alternatives. And what I call post-politics is the fact that today, with the move toward the center of social democratic parties, because now we've got basically center-right, center-left who defend the same kind of politics, because they believe that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So they don't have a choice anymore, they don't have a voice. So this is what I call the abandon of the value of popular sovereignty. And equality, well, as we know very well, our societies have become more and more unequal. Think, for instance, of the work of Thomas Piketty, where he has shown that in the last 30 years, the gulf has been established between a group each time smaller or very, very rich, and on the other side, proletarianization and pauperization, precarization of the rest. So the idea of equality, it does not really make any sense anymore. Our societies are much more unequal. And this is what I call the populist moment, is we are suddenly, and that is begun, of course, the 2008 crisis has been very important in this crisis of neoliberal hegemony. But today we are seeing a series of movement, resistances against those this post-democracy in both its aspect of post-politics and oligarchization. A good example of that, in fact, is the movement of the Gilets jaunes in France. Because if you see what are the revendications of the Gilets jaunes, mainly there are two. One which concerns the question of equality. For instance, we know that this is how it all started because they were refusing to be taxed, the only one to be taxed. You know, they were told, but it's in favor of climate change. But of course, they were the only one who were supposed. They've been presented as being against, ecology. It's not true. What they are saying is, why aren't you taxing the rich? Because finally, it's people who use planes which are the more dangerous. And we are, in fact, supposed to be the one paying for that. So there is a question definitively of equality, demand for equality. And of course, the other one, with their movement for what they call the RIC, referendum, the intervention citoyenne, is to have a voice. So I think that this populist movement is precisely that. It's a series of resistances against this post-democracy. And I don't want to be too long here, but we can develop the second point. Those resistances can be articulated in many different ways. They can be articulated in right-wing populism, or they can be articulated in left-wing populism. Basically, what's at stake here is, I think that in both cases there is a demand for recovery of democracy. But right-wing populism want to recover democracy in order to restrict it. Democracy, yes, but for the national, and of course, the people who are considered as migrants are not going to be part of the people, while on the case of left populism is also to fight against post-democracy, to want to recover democracy, but in this case is in order to deepen it and to extend it, to radicalize it. So this is how I see the situation, what I call the populist moment. But I think what's at stake here and what is important is that the way to react against, because obviously I recognize it can be a danger for democracy if right-wing populism become the hegemonic movement, if they are the one who are able to articulate those demands in order of restricting it, because it could lead, and in fact it's already leading, to some kind of authoritarian nationalistic government. But it's not by defending really existing neoliberal democracy, with this post-democracy that you are going to be able to fight against them. You need to try to recognize the importance of those resistances and articulate them in another way.
Do you relate this post-democratic condition to an economic development? I mean, we have, as Colin Crouch says, we have the dominance of financial industry, of transnational unities, and they are destroying, and they are producing neoliberal democracy.
Well, they are, the question, I agree with Colin Crouch there, and that's precisely what when I refer to question oligarchization. Oligarchization is precise. Well, basically, what we understand by neoliberalism is a new form of regulation of capitalism where financial capital has become the most important, and all that, of course, is a consequence of the image hegemony of financial capital, this process of oligarchization. But I think, and this is why I've written some places to say, well, post-democracy, if it insists only on the economic, leave aside an aspect which I think is important, which is what I call the resistance against post-politics. And I also, I think Colin Cross will agree on that with me. In fact, we've already been in discussion. And he used to say, well, we agree, you are a bit more radical than I am, he say, but basically we agree. What I feel is that I want to insist very strongly on what I see as the responsibility of socialist or social democratic parties in the evolution of this post-democracy.
So they showed us just an alternative way to react on this post-democratic condition. That's what you say.
Yeah, I think that we need to see that there are two aspects in post-democracy. Yeah. There is definitely the economic one, but it's not the only one, because it's also the fact that the kind of this consensus at the center, as I call it, for instance, the third way, the Blair model, which has become hegemonic. Of course, it began in Britain with, well, it was consequence of the moment in which Blair replaced Thatcher. There was absolutely no putting into question of neoliberalism, but simply they say, well, there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So what social democratic parties can do is to manage it in a more humane way, And I think that, so basically, not putting into question, not trying to establish a different hegemonic system, but I say usually, maybe a bit so, they capitulated to neoliberalism, the Social Democrats. And that, of course, began in Britain, but we've seen that happening in
Germany too.
Germany with the Mitte of Schröder, and then in everywhere in Europe, I think that's at the origin of what I call this moment of resistance, which is the populist moment. So what I want to insist here is that this populist moment, I see those resistance as legitimate. And here I know that there are a lot of people that would disagree with me, but I think that the demands which are expressed by right-wing populist parties are originally democratic demands, because they are resistances against post-democracy. But of course, democratic demands can be articulated, expressed in different ways, and this is why I want to insist on this point, because my article in the book is both theoretical and political, because I try to show one of the reasons why social democrats are completely there, they can't understand what is really happening, is because of what I call their rationalism and their essentialism, and they believe that they don't realize that certain demands can be expressed in ways. For instance, it's evident that workers' demands are not necessarily progressive. They can be expressed, for instance, and this is very much what Marine Le Pen is good at. She speaks with the popular sector and say, yes, I understand your problem, but it's the immigrants which are responsible. It's because of the immigrant that you so it's and if it's the only disco which is available, as it was during a long time in France, then of course the workers are constructed as subject. Their subjectivity is that it's because of that, and this is why I think that the only way to fight against that, and this is fortunately what Jean-Luc Mélenchon and La France Insoumise have begun to do, is to go and understand the problem that those people live, but give another articulation, formulate them in another way, to say, for instance, yes, you've got those problems, but the responsible are the transnational corporations. It's financial capitalism because of that. So the question, and this is why, in fact, this movement can be called a populist movement. Populist is, and here I'm basing my approach on what Ernesto Laclau is developing in his book on populist reason. He say that populist, when we speak of populism, is not an ideology, is not a regime, is not something which has got a particular already content. It's a way to construct the political frontier between the people and the establishment. Here it's interesting to see that constructing a political frontier, of course, is something that goes against the traditional liberal view. Blair used to say, we are all middle class, no, so there is no, so the idea that there is no antagonism, no political frontier. Marxism do construct a political frontier, but it constructs the political frontier on the basis of the capital against labor, working class against the bourgeoisie. And I think that certainly today, this is not appropriate anymore because with the transformation of capitalism, financial capitalism, in fact, there are many more people. It's not really as far as you are working in a factory that you are subjected to capitalism. We are all, in a sense, in post-for this kind of societies affected by that. So this is what I think, and that's an idea that we find really interestingly enough in many of those left populist movements. The idea that there are many more people now who can be won over to a project of transformation than before, because many more people are subjected to the kind of capitalist logic, you see. So I think that's it's important to understand that the need to construct a collective will, a political subject that is wider, that is not only in terms of class. By the way, that was already our argument in Hegemony Socialist Strategy, which was, translated in, by Passagen, because at that moment we were saying that the socialist project could not be anymore conceived only in terms of class. It needed to also take account the importance of what was called at the moment a social movement, feminism, anti-racism. And so I think that by the way, it's interesting to see that the term populism does not appear at all in Hegemony. But the idea was there, already. The idea was there because it was the idea that you need to construct I don't like the term progressive, but a subject, an actor, political actor in much wider, more transversal. This is something which I think is very important.
But that opposes to Marxist theory. I mean, I think that is reproached to you. We've been, I know, but in fact, we are usually considered as the origin of what they call the post-Marxist current, And it's interesting because before the publication of Hegemony, we published an Estonian article in a journal that was called at the Marxism Today, in which we were developing already some of those ideas, and of course the reaction. You must remember, this book was published in 1985, so things have changed a lot since then. And the reaction was very, very violent. I mean, we were accused, you are post-Marxist, you abandon Marxism. That was before the published the book. And then, in fact, when we published the book, we said, well, we've been called post-Marxist, but we assume the term, why not, on condition that is post-Marxist. It's post, but it's also Marxism. In Marxism, we come, both Ernesto and I, in different ways, because my Marxism was always very Gramsci, but we come from the Marxist tradition. So we don't want to we're certainly not anti-Marxist. It's not saying to say that we need to abandon Marxism. Our idea was that, well, Marx is not the Quran. It's not something that you need. Exactly why you have to refer to Marxism.
You can, adapt it, and so it's a form.
Who tells you that you have to adapt the theory from the 19th century?
Yeah, well, a lot
if you
of
analyze this, today's conditions,
Well, a lot of even today, I see a lot of. For instance, it's quite interesting. I think this discussion. There are a lot of Marxists who are trying to show that the question of ecology was already central in Marx.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. It's absurd, because obviously it was not. But there is this kind of attitude. Marx must have already said everything,
The funny thing that we see around us a strong revival of Marxist theory, and I ask myself why we have to return to the 19th century if we have today's theories, for example, used to explain what's going on and to find ways to get out of this.
Yeah, I agree, but there is some kind of religious attitude, you know, with, by the way, I find, I'm not against the fact, I think it's a good thing that there is an interest for Marx against among the young people, you know, because for a long time, because there are, I think there are still in Marx some analyses which are important, some concepts which are important, or let's put it differently. I think the insistence on the role of the economy, you know, that's something that is important. It's important. And because there's been a tendency, in fact, it was quite funny because even after writing the book, at some point I realized in discussion when I was saying, okay, well, but you know, and what about the economic condition? And then people, oh, you are an reconstructed Marxist.
Yeah.
Because I was saying that, you know, economic conditions are also important. So there've been a tendency, I think, to leave aside the role of the economy. And today, the fact that, you know, people are beginning, that I think is important. On condition, of course, we're not trying to say, okay, you know, we need to only to do that on the basis of Marx said. But an interest for Marx and the role of the economy, that I think that if it does not take, you know, a form of religious form, it's important.
Well, I think also that especially the Capital explains many things of today's development. I mean, that everything becomes a Ware.
Marchandise. This
is
of course. No.
true. You have your eyes, you see it around you.
I do think.
And so on. And the concentration of capital and all this is still going on.
But you know, you need to. But you need to develop that. For instance, the work of one Marxist, which I find quite interesting, is David Harvey. And I think the work of David Harvey is interesting because he's really, you know, try to develop, for instance, there is a concept in Harvey which I find quite interesting, accumulation by dispossession. You know, he showed that some form of that we find in Marx, some concept are useful on condition of, you know, being readapted in order for new conditions. So well, this is, you know, when we say we are post-Marxist, is because we think that, you know, it's a tradition in which need to be, not to abandon it, but a tradition need to be livened, you know, it is not something static. So, and of course, well, for instance, in the case of Gramsci, we definitively, and Gramsci probably is the one Marxist that we feel closer to, but even in the case of Gramsci, for instance, we are saying that there are aspects in which we are going beyond Gramsci. The fact that for Gramsci, hegemony was necessarily the hegemony of a class. He believed that only, you know, today, after the hegemony of the bourgeoisie, only the working class, the proletariat, could become hegemonic. I mean, this, of course, is something that, you know, does not make sense for today. But so you say you need to really develop those concepts.
If you analyze the populist condition and our possibilities to return to or to refine or rebuild democracy, this is from a so-called leftist position. And how you explain, you explain in your book that the left, political left, has one big, misses one big question, the question of affects. If you don't ask what are the affects, you cannot explain today's development towards right-wing populism.
No. And but you see that is one aspect of what I call the essentialism and the rationalism, which is dominant in the left
The
in
left.
this general sense. You know.
Whatever.
In fact, there is something that Deleuze used to say, and I think very appropriate. He say, I'm going to say it in fact, il y a des images de la pensée qui nous empêchent de penser. There are images of thought that impede us to think. Mm-hmm. And I will say there are images of politics which impede us to think politically. And I think that the image of politics which is dominant in the left is an image that impedes us to think politically. You know, the idea, for instance, which is so widespread among left people, and I think they explain in great part their opposition to populism, that mobilization of affect, that's only something that the right does, you know. We, on the left, we only use arguments. Well, I think that is very, very, very dangerous because the affective dimension is very important in the construction of political identities. And this, of course, links to the question I was saying about anti-essentialism. In fact, in Hegemony, you will remember, we criticized Marxism precisely for what we call its class essentialism. The idea that subjectivity was always an expression of your position in the relation of production. You know, so in fact, if you're a worker, you should have certain form of subjectivity, and if you did not happen to have it, as false consciousness, you know. So that we put into question in our book, and from that point of view, it's a book which is an articulation between the thought of Gramsci and post-structuralism. You know, for instance, the influence of Derrida is very strong in our work, the influence of Lacan also, and Foucault to a lesser aspect, but also, so the idea that the social is discursively constructed. You know, there is not something which is there. You don't have things that happen and that are represented in thought. Not identities, of course, but the social is always a discursive construction. So there is, and this is why, in fact, you know, you can have the possibility of democratic demands. By that I understand resistance is when post-democracy can be articulated in many different ways. I gave you already an example with respect to the demand of the worker, but for instance, and I think that's particularly important for me today, ecology. Ecology is not necessarily progressive, you know. There can be many different forms of ecology. You can have a very authoritarian form of ecology. You can Absolutely. Have nowadays the green capitalism and things like that. So there are always many different ways in which certain resistances can be articulated. And if you don't understand that, you cannot really understand, or you can fight against the development of, you know, those kind of articulation of right-wing populism. But to insist on what you were saying, the question of the effects, I think, again, but that's what I understand basically by the anti-essentialism. And here again, I was speaking of Derrida and Lacan, but the influence of Freud is very important in our work, you know. When we insist on the fact that, well, identities are always the result of a process of identification. You never have, identity is not something. And in the process of identification, there is always a very important affective dimension, what they call a libidinal investment. And I think that this is one very important to understand the way in which political identities are created. The fact that there is always a certain affective dimension. And it's not by, you know, pure, I'm not saying that they should not give argument, you know, but I mean, there is some tendency, which I think are in a sense rather comical. I remember discussing with some leftists who were convinced that the way to fight against racism is to teach people the fact that race do not exist. Science has proved that race do not exist. So if you and if people are racist, it's because they don't know that race don't exist. So, you should teach them. Another example on that line, that was something that American leftist was, won't say his name, but he's very well known, he was convinced that the reason, socialism did not really exist in the US, it was because the workers did not know the Marxist theory of value. He said if the American workers knew the Marxist theory of value, they will all become, Marxist socialists. So he was, and he dedicated a lot of energy to that, organizing courses and an institute all over the US to teach the Marxists, the worker, the Marxist theory of value. That shows you that this is not how you are going to construct new form of subjectivity. And it's certainly not something that make room for the affective dimension of creation of identities. So what I want to insist on that, because I'm very, very convinced that the great problem with the left today is precisely this attitude that affects and what I call passion. By passion I refer to common affects, because I think that it's very important when politically, because political identities are always collective identities. That's also something that I think that, certain form of liberalism and individualism do not understand. It's always, politics is always a creation of us. And that requires the determination of a them. The them is not necessarily an enemy, but the them can just be a difference. But you can't have politics without an us-them creation. And this is why politics is necessarily partisan. Again, that's something that most of the liberal democratic thought want to evacuate, because they believe that democracy is about creation of consensus. And for me, and there I will agree with Jacques Rancière, it's not about consensus, it's about dissensus and how you institutionalize, create the condition for this dissensus, to exist, to manifest itself without leading to civil war. So well, in fact, here, maybe one thing that can help to understand, because I think it's very important in our approach, the basic of democracy we are saying is there are basically two ways to think about what is the political. This one way, which is called the associative conception, and say that the political has got to do with acting in common, looking for consensus, the sphere of liberty, and this is the idea which is dominant in most of the liberal democratic theory. And then there is a view which is called the dissociative view of the political, which say, no, politics has got to do with conflict and antagonism. If there is politics, it's because there is conflict, Mm-hmm. And this is a tradition that one finds, for instance, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Weber, Claude Lefort, Jacques Rancière. It's a different understanding of the mm-hmm. political. And I think that this explains very much why there is this strong opposition to populism, because populism is inscribed necessarily in the dissociative view, because populism is how you construct the frontier between the people and the establishment. And for instance, very often people ask me, but why do you insist on having us, them? Why can't we just create necessarily some kind of consensus? And I say, but no, but that is to dream of a world where there is no more politics. We need to start from the fact that there are conflict, that there are antagonism. And the struggle, the objective of democracy is not to arrive to a rational consensus, it's to manage to deal with this antagonism, in a way which is going to permit the existence of a pluralist system.
I think the question of identification as a process of building identity is a crucial point, the right-wing populism does it through the terms of nationalism.
Right-wing populism, eh? Right-wing populism.
But my question, I'm just thinking, what first, of course, which notions could be, or what could be the identifying point for left-wing populism? And another question is, could we reuse or could we take this notion of nationalism, of the notions that are used by right-wing nationalism, populism, and redefine it for left-wing population or something like that?
Well, there is a big discussion about that, yes, and in fact, many, for instance, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is constantly criticized for giving importance to the nation. But, you know, I don't think that giving importance to the nation is necessarily to lead to the kind of restrictive authoritarian nationalism. It's true that from that point of view, the French have got an advantage because of the French Revolution, you know, so you can have a view of the nation. By the way, something interesting is that the France is the only country where the national anthem is also a revolutionary anthem, you know, la Marseillaise. So there is a tradition in which they can inscribe a view of the nation which is universalist, which is open. And for instance, I'm very much believe in the notion of what I call left-wing patriotism. You know, I think because, in fact, it's quite interesting. Here in Austria, the question of patriotism is something that really people in the left are totally against, you know. And I've been having a lot of discussion about that because people think, no, patriotism. I remember several years ago a discussion with a friend of mine in what I was saying. I've never met a country where the left is so anti-patriotic than in Austria. And he was saying to me, but that's our way of being patriotic, to be anti-patriotic. So, you know, no, I think well, again, that's you see, if you are going to try to fight against right-wing populism, because this is something which is central in my work, and it creates a lot of opposition. I believe that at the moment, many people who do vote for right-wing populist parties, and here, of course, I particularly think the case of France, could be won over for a progressive alternative, you know, because for a long, in the success of Marine Le Pen can, particularly in the popular sector, come from the fact that she was till the birth of La France Insoumise, the only one who was really, you know, trying to understand and speak with those people who had been abandoned by the Socialist Party. In fact, there is still a discussion today with particularly Eric Fassin, who argue we should not even speak, he said, with people who vote for the Front National, because those people are inherently fascist, racist, homophobe. So those is the idea of the leper of Macron. No? No. Well, I don't believe that. I believe that, and in fact, he was saying, and that has been proven wrong, because he wrote this book, Populisme, le grand ressentiment, just before the last election in France. And he was saying it's unthinkable that people who voted for Marine Le Pen could ever vote for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. It's not true. In fact, it has been shown that there was, in fact, both Mélenchon in Marseille and François Ruffin in Amiens have been elected in areas which are very much dominated by Marine Le Pen, because they went to speak with those people. You know, and I remember, because I'm a friend of François Ruffin, who was telling me, by the way, he was very much criticized by the good left. You know, you mix with those people. same thing happened with the Gilets jaunes, you know. For instance, there is a tendency in certain type of left to say, no, those are we should not engage with them. But François Ruffin was telling me he went to speak with those people, try to understand their concern, and precisely he realized that they had been convinced their subjectivity had been constructed in such a way that they saw the immigrants as the responsible for their situation. And discussing with them, he make them say, no, it's the big national transportation. And he said during the discussion, he saw them, he said, for instance, they would say, yes, you've got a point, dear. And some of them at the end say, you've convinced me, I'm going to vote for you. People would voted originally for Marine Le Pen, you know. So I think that, I'm not saying that, you know, one can do that with everybody, of course. They are die-hard racists, but I think a quite important sector can be won over because they voted for Marine Le Pen because they've been abandoned by socialists. This is something, for instance, which if you've read the book by Didier Ribon, Retour à Reims, he shows an example of that, you know. His family and people in Reims who were communists, now they are all voting for Marine Le Pen because Marine Le Pen was the only one who was, you know, having a discourse with respect to those people. So this is something which for me is quite important to realize that the struggle is an hegemonic struggle that, you know, we should not take it for granted that those people are the die-hard racist. And this is also why I'm very much against a certain tendency to call those movements fascist, you know. And I insist that for me, right-wing populism is more indicative. It's not that there are no fascists. For instance, in the case of Bolsonaro, I think that this is really a fascist movement. Fascist movement. And I think that to call that a tropical Trump is not, no, it's much worse than Trump, much worse. But, you know, most of the right-wing populist movement, to call them neo-Nazi, to call them fascist, well, it does not help you. It makes you feel good, you know, because it's moral condemnation. Yeah. We are the good and they are the bad, you know.
But it doesn't help politically.
It doesn't help you to understand anything. And in fact, I think it's also a way for the Social Democrats to avoid making an autocritic. Because they've got also it's a return of the brown plague, is that we don't have to try to understand. It's like a meteorological phenomenon, you know. It comes. We don't know, but and we are not responsible for it. I think, and that's what I was saying at the beginning. It's important to realize the role of the responsibility of social democratic parties in this movement. And if you don't do that autocritic, then you are never going to, and you are going to, those are, you know, fascists. So no, that I think is really very, very dangerous way. We need to try to understand, you know, what attracts people in those movements, why, in which way they've been able to articulate, you know, the enter in resonance with the problem of the people, and of course to try to offer another discourse, a progressive discourse.
How would you describe this left-wing populist strategy to get these people from the right-wing populist to the left-wing populist?
Well, of course, there is no. Well, first, of course, look. First, of course, I want to insist.
Well, the main features of it.
Yeah. But first, I want to insist that of course, the main objective of left populist strategy is not to win back because there are also, for instance, the abstentionists, which are important, and basically for me, what's important, and here again, this is in relation to what we were saying in hegemony and socialist strategy. Today, all those resistances against post-democracy, because not all of them have been articulated by the right-wing populism, of course, but there exist all those, and it's important to offer a discourse to establish that, again, is a concept that we develop in hegemony, establish what we call a chain of equivalence between the demands of the working class, but also the demand of the precarized middle class, of the feminists, of the anti-racists, of the migrants, and of course all the demand about ecology. So there are a multiplicity of democratic demands that need to be articulated. We need to establish a project in which people feel that establish a collective will on the basis of that. Collective will whose objective is recovery and radicalization of democracy. Because I think that what all those demands have in common is, in different ways, but a call for democracy. So that's basically the strategy. But within this strategy, I think that an aspect of it is to say those people who vote for right-wing populism could also become part of that. You know, exactly. Yeah. It's not, and because, I mean, for instance, there is something which I like very much in the strategy of Podemos in Spain, when they speak construction of a transversal subject. They say, we don't want to address ourselves only to the people who have traditionally voted for the left, who consider themselves to be on the left, because there are many people today who have voted for the Partido Popular, the right, who could be won over to a project of radicalization of democracy. And by the way, I mean, there is a point in which maybe I'm too optimistic about that, but I think it's important today, particularly given the question of the climate change. I believe that, because sometimes we are saying, oh, but you know, they are the losers of globalization and they are the winner. The loser of globalization, you are never going to be able to make them join a left populist movement. I don't believe that, you know, because I think that among the the winners of neoliberal globalization, the people can feel, you know, their situation is very good, but they've got children and they've got grandchildren. And they might become aware of the fact that this neoliberal model is really something that put the planet into danger. So personally, they might be in a good situation, but if they are going to think, what kind of world do I want to leave to my children? So this will be, it seems to me, an argument to make them join the people that want to radicalize democracy. Yeah, yeah. And of course, I mean, and I want to insist on that, today, absolutely the central question is to offer an alternative to neoliberal globalization, because and if the left doesn't do it, then it's the right who is going to do it, you know. And it's not by pretending we are going to defend
There's
no.
one place to occupy, right wing or left wing.
Yeah. For me, I think that what we are living today is what I call a return of the political after a year of post-politics. Return of the political that can open the way to authoritarian regime. That's a real danger. But it can also open the way to much more democratic societies, and all that depends on which is going to be in the struggle between left populism and right populism, who is going to become hegemonic. And this is why I think that today there is it's a crucial conjuncture, you know. It's a moment in which things, bifurcation are possible. But I have the feeling that the left is not really aware of that.
I think this program has no place in the political left-wing political parties of today. If you see in Germany, Sarah Wagenknecht, who tried this, or other, they are marginalized, and the parties continue to neglect this. Is this probably the reason why you can have this construction of the people, of this force who resist against neoliberal post-democratic structures is outside the political parties, in social movements.
But you see, the problem is that social movements on their own are not going to for instance, we've seen what happened with the Occupy and all that, you know.
Don't act.
I know. That's the question. That's the question. But left populism is precisely a project to articulate what I call the horizontal and the vertical dimension. You know, the social movement with an attempt to transform the institution, to enter into the political system, but in order to come to power. You know, in order to change that. And I think that much of the social movement, they are much too horizontalist. They don't want, and in a sense, it's, I think, a little bit the problem with the Gilets jaunes also, you know, because the Gilets jaunes, they don't want to have anything to do with parties. They don't want to.
But politically, if you see the green, started outside political parties, the political spectrum, the spectra of political parties. This is, I think, a usual development. If you have a certain, if these social movements get a certain force, then they transform into political parties or.
I agree, but that's the danger. That's the danger that you enter into the system and then you get trapped into the system. I know. That's a danger, and that's in a sense a problem that to a certain extent Podemos has been one. It's very difficult to maintain one foot inside the institution and one foot in la calle, as they say, the street. It is difficult, but I think that is definitively, and that's certainly the objective of left populism. To articulate the more institutional dimension with the social movement and to it's definitively.
But I think it would be a progress to get the right analysis. We have not to provide solutions tonight. I got the sign that we have to open the discussion for the public. Please do it.
Maybe we start right here.
So what do you foresee as possible futures in 30 years from now? Will we have new feudalism, or will we, several possibilities, or will it be like in the 70s, acceptable democracy, or what is your feeling about the future?
Well, I'm not terribly optimistic, I must say. Because, but let's say, in a sense, I think that at least we are seeing, if respect to, even I will say 5 years ago, certainly more, the young movement towards trying to offer an alternative to resolve this crisis of neoliberal hegemony in a way that put into question neoliberal hegemony. For instance, what's happening in Britain with the transformation of the Labour Party under Corbyn is very important. It's very important because it shows, I must say, I was for a long time rather dubious on the possibility of social democratic parties to transform themselves. I thought that they were really beyond repair. And the experience of Corbyn had made me seeing things differently. It's possible because with Corbyn, the Labour Party is transforming itself into a left populist party. And they recognize that, it's not my invention. They recognize it. So this is something that we are going to see. I'm more cautious about the possibility. What's going to happen in Spain could be interesting too, because under the push of Podemos, the PSOE definitively become more radicalized, and so it's possible also that the PSOE will follow to a certain extent which of course here it could be ironical, because if the PSOE is really transformed into a left populist party, it means that Podemos will not disappear, but it will. The role of Podemos will have been to push the socialists. But after all, what's important is what happened in the country. It's not that. So for people who are identified with Podemos, they might say, well, we were so successful that in fact now the PSOE has become a left populist, so our role is reduced. I think that there are some indication that the crisis of neoliberalism, there are places where there are alternatives, what you are beginning to see. But of course, it's obvious, we are aware that at the moment, the more important tendency is right-wing populism. But the question is that, if we do not begin to understand that the way to fight against right-wing populism is by developing left populism, then of course we are going to. I think that, and there is a danger, and I think we see that to a certain extent in France with Macron. Countries who want to defend the neoliberal model, absolutely, are becoming more and more repressive. I mean, the government of Macron, in its reaction to the Gilets jaunes, has become really much more, repressive. So it's some kind of very authoritarian neoliberalism that is being developed, because they under the popular pressure, they instead of having an alternative, because in a sense, obviously that's why Macron could not make things that would satisfy the Gilets jaunes, because the demand of the Gilets jaunes were too much in contradiction with, when Macron came to power in France, his diagnostic was that the problem with France is that he's not completed his neoliberal revolution. And it's true in a sense, if I compare with Britain, there are many more aspects of the welfare state that still anything. We are going to push it there. And of course, the reaction of no, we don't want this. So there is really an antagonism there, and Macron can't satisfy the demand of the Gilets jaunes without abandoning his whole project. So, and then of course this is why this kind of defense of neoliberalism become necessarily very repressive. So it's also a possibility, that we are going towards a more repressive form of neoliberalism, that in order to survive, but at least we are seeing that there is an alternative, which is not at the moment the one which is really becoming hegemonic, but there is, and this is in a sense, I could say that this last book for left populism, I really insist that it's a political intervention. Of course, there is a theoretical aspect, but it's really a cry to say, look, realize which this populist moment, what's really happening, and how the left.
Chantal, we have so many more questions. We should give them the possibility to be raised. Okay.
Okay.
So okay. There was in the back. You got the mic in the meantime, please.
I would like to pick up on the issue of left-wing nationalism, and from more from a practical perspective. So, is it possible to find a solution to the problem of mobile capital, or to the problem of climate change at a national level?
I suggest we have a second remark by Vangelis in the very back row. Is that okay? Can we?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Chantal Mouffe, you consider populism as a response to post-democracy. And I would like to raise an objection based also on empirical evidence. And in my view, what the Greek experience shows is that populism is compatible with post-democracy. As Syriza is a left populist party which entered into a coalition with the right populist party. That is, first we have a populist in power and a post-democratic structure. Then Syriza organized a referendum. The result of the referendum was that 64% of the population was against the austerity program. And Syriza turned the result into exactly the opposite. That is, we observe a politics totally ignoring the sovereignty of people. And third, and this is, I think, very interesting, we always observe a post-democratic rhetoric because Syriza says there is no alternative. It's exactly what the left parties before Syriza government said. I would like to hear just a comment by you concerning now the Greek developments, the developments in Greece.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer very quickly the first one. Look, I'm not defending left-wing nationalism. That's not because what I insist in answer to the question of Peter is that the idea of the nation is not necessarily something right-wing. It can be articulated in a very progressive way. The question, what I am insisting in the book is that a left populist strategy must begin at the level of the nation state, but not stay at the level of the nation state. And of course, it's evident that today we are not going to be able to fight against neoliberalism only the level of Austria or France. But it's important to start from the create a real collective, and then, of course, establish a relation with other movements. So I'm not a sovereignist. I know that there are some people who will insist on it, but I'm not. The way I understand left populism is not sovereignist. It's not coming back to your little country. No. So that's what I. Question of Greece. Well, I think that. Tsipras has been, of course, presented as a traitor to them. The poor Tsipras, I think, did not really have an alternative. And in this case, because it's different to say there is no alternative to a certain situation and there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. That's not at the same level, But if Tsipras, well, first, two things. Definitively, the strategy of Tsipras to arrive to power was a left populist strategy, and it worked because he won the election on the left populist strategy. The question is that left populism, or populism in general, and that's something that Ernesto Lacroix says, is not a regime. Let's say a left populist movement, its objective is not to establish a populist regime. There is no such a thing as a populist regime. So I think that once it came to power, of course, it's going to establish a different form of regime. The question that Tsipras was not able to do was to put in practice is anti-austerity politics, but that is because of the European Union. I mean, if it had not been this obstruction of the European Union, he would have been able to put into practice. In fact, it's interesting. I don't want to be too long, but here I've got an anecdote. I was in a conference in Zagreb called the Subversive Conference with Tsipras a few months before the election. And he was presenting in that conference his project, and everybody was saying, yeah, but do you think the European Union is going to leave you? And I think the guy was too naive. That was his problem. And I remember he said, because I took note of that, he said, oh, we've got an atomic weapon. Because we are going to say to if they don't accept, we are going to say then we leave the European Union. Except that his atomic weapon was, en français on sait, désamorcé, because Schäuble wanted, you know, the Greek to leave the European Union. So in fact, you can't use a weapon, something, perfect, go away, you know. So in fact, its atomic weapon did not work. And I think that there is I've got the disagreement with Jean-Luc Mélenchon about that, because Jean-Luc Mélenchon said that Tsipras was a traitor. Look, honestly, I don't see what alternative Tsipras had, because first the Greek people didn't want to leave the European Union, because one thing was to vote against the policies of austerity, but it was not a question, and if not, we are going to leave. That was not, and they didn't want to. And on the other side, it would have been, you know, complete economic chaos, and some people, I mean, the people who left Syriza on this moment say, no, we should have defaulted, and I mean, this is complete illusion, you know. I think that it was no alternative. I must say that for me, the experience of Syriza was important, but making me ask, is it possible to develop this kind of policy within the context of the European Union? I mean, that I think is still a very big question, you know. But I don't think that, but the alliance with ANEL, well, I don't think that ANEL was a right-wing populist party. It was a nationalist party, definitively, but not right-wing populist. And of course, you know, what they had in common at that moment was the fact that to wanting to defend, you know, well, some kind of national project. So I don't think that is not, for instance, like if Jean-Luc Mélenchon will make alliance with Marine Le Pen. That would be really, really unacceptable. But you know, the alliance between Tsipras and ANEL was not on that type, really.
So Chantal, I think we can have one more question that I already promised to the lady in front here. I will just give you my mic, please.
Well, okay. Thank you very much. I have a worry, and I remember after your work with Ernesto Laclau, one of the most paradigm cases to prove the point you wanted to make about populism were the so-called new democracies of the 21st century in Latin America, like the government of Chavez, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina even. And now we've come to see that after this left populism moment of rupture, where the antagonism of the people really was heard, was represented through those governments, it came to an end. It came to a return to the most radical forms of repressive neoliberalism. In Brazil, it's evident with Bolsonaro now. So my question would be, do you think there's the possibility that when such a moment, a populist moment happens here in Europe, that gives place to a new return to a neoliberalism, a most radical form of neoliberalism as it happened with those cases in Latin America? I don't know if...
Well, it's difficult to answer such a question. But by the way, I mean, I would not say that in Latin America it came to an end, because, for instance, the perspective in Argentina of a return of Cristina Kirchner, this time not as the but as vice, is very possible. Because definitively Macri has completely destroyed the country, you know. So I think there was certainly a setback, absolutely. But look, for instance, now we've seen in Mexico the contrary. There's advantage. You know, history does not just follow. You've got setback and then you advance it. So, but in the case of Europe, I don't know. Well, nothing is ever guaranteed. That's what I will tell you. You know, so the fact that and yeah, the case of Tsipras show. Well, maybe we are going to see what happens in next election. But if New Democracy win the election, of course you will have. So it's kind of difficult to answer that. What I would say, but that is not exactly your question, but is that if we don't have a development of a left populist alternative in Europe, I think that the perspectives are really worrying, because you will either have a victory of right-wing populists or the development of what I was saying before, some kind of very regressive form of neoliberalism, you know, because neoliberalism is definitively, I'm absolutely convinced on that. In fact, we are going to have soon here in IWM Wolfgang Streich giving a lecture, and I think that in his book Buying Times, he does say clearly that he say the possibility which existed under, you know, the Keynesian model of some kind of combination between liberalism and democracy, that has come to an end. I mean, not liberalism, capitalism, sorry, capitalism. There is really, we won't be able to maintain this idea that you have democracy and this kind of capitalism. So he's not saying that, you know, we need to have a socialist revolution, but and of course that's a point that we did not discuss. But this left populist things is not the socialist revolution. You know, in fact, I speak of radical reformism. Is a form of it's some form of radicalized social democracy in a sense, you know. Yeah. This is something which for me will be the best possible development. I mean, to put an end to the hegemony of neoliberalism, which has created this post-democracy, to recover democracy, and then try to find ways in which we can, you know, democratize societies. But of course, here I want to insist, it's not a blueprint. It's not something that, for instance, it's going to take many from different in France, in Britain, in Spain. You know, the radicalization of democracy is something that needs to be starting from, you know, what is the movement, but let's say open the possibility for this to develop. I think that for me is the only way. If that does not work, then I think that we are in for very, very difficult time in Western Europe, you know, because it's definitively much more repressive form of regime, either in the neoliberal form or in some kind of new authoritarianism or illiberal democracy, or
Let's take this as the final word, I suggest. The good thing about doing not a classical book presentation is that tonight we had one of 9 authors here, so there is 8 times as much to be discovered in the book, Wenn Demokratien, demokratisch, untergehen. So don't forget it on your way out. We have the book offer of Passagen Verlag just outside of the room to your right hand. This book and many more. And Chantal, Peter Engelmann reminds me of that. Chantal offered to also sign the books. So there's this book and many more outside. And also on your way of leaving the Institute in some time, not right now, because as you remember, you're invited for wine and cheese downstairs. But when then sometime leaving the Institute, also don't forget about the brand new issue of IWM Post. The title of it this time is Democracies Descent. So this is really the title for tonight. And in the IWM Post, we also have excerpts of 3 of the contributions in our volume. Boaventura de Sousa Santos on the Brazilian democracy. Bolsonaro was touched upon shortly also. We have Natia Urbinati on the difference of party democracy and populist democracy. And last not least, we also have a very short excerpt of the presentation by Chantal Mouffe in our IWM Post. And there's also an interview with Czech political scientist Pavel Basha, who in his interview holds that also liberal elites can be dangerous to democracy. This is also very fitting to this issue. Now you're all invited downstairs for a glass of wine and some cheese. Please join us. And I will end this evening with thanking Peter Engelmann for moderating this talk, and most of all for thanking Chantal Mouffe for being with us and sharing your insights with us tonight. And the really most impressive thing about you, Chantal, is that you're not just advocating passion for democracy, but that you're incorporating it. And I really enjoyed that. So have a good evening. Thank you.